Good day, grade 12s. I hope that you are enjoying school right now. But today we will be focusing on again history. And our topic is again the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, it's imperative that we understand, grade 12s, that the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is question 1 in paper 1. And it's a source-based question. Now, let's focus quickly to the board here, quickly to the whiteboard. The topic 1 is a source-based question, the extension of the Cold War, which is important. But let's focus quickly on the exam guidelines. When you look at the exam guidelines, there's 3 points that we're looking at. It is the roles of the USA and USSR in Cuba. This is what the question pertains. The second dot refers to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The last one talks about containment and brinkmanship, and then it explains Cuba as an example. So those are the 3 points that we are looking for when the question paper is being set up. Now, before we start with the topic, let's quickly go to the concepts that needs to be remembered when we are dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You will see the first one is the Cold War. What was the Cold War all about? Very important, very pertinent that we understand that the Cold War started after World War II. But what is the definition of it? It's an ideology of war between USA, which was capitalism, and Soviet Union, they supported communism. Then the second one, number 2, capitalism. What is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system driven by personal freedom of choice, investment of capital, and the use of labor and resources to make a profit. So what does it mean? Capitalism is personal gain. Number 3, communism. What is communism? Communism is a belief, it's a doctrine, it's a belief that advocates, encourages a classless society, take note, classless society in which private ownership has been abolished by means of production which belongs, take note, production which belongs to the community, industry, agriculture, are controlled by the state. It's controlled by the state. Then the government controls most of the aspects of the people's lives. Very important that we understand that. When we come to democracy, it is the citizens of a country that have the ability to choose their representatives and to effectively take part in the decisions made on issues that affect them and society in general. When we go to containment, the USA attempt action to stop the spread of communism, So when we look at the word contain, we know that the dictionary talks about contain as keeping something. But we can see here the definition is the USA attempt to stop the spread of communism. What are they trying to keep? Capitalism. When we look at blockade, it's an action by the USA, take note, it's an action by the USA to stop Soviet ships transporting missiles into Cuba. When we look at quarantine, the USA imposed a blockade, take note, they impose a blockade on Soviet ships from being transported to Cuba. The last one, brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is the practice, especially in international relations, take note, international relations, of taking a dispute to the verge, very important, very pertinent, dispute to the verge of conflict in the hope of forcing the opposition to make consensus. Now the topic starts with a little bit of background. What were the reasons for the Cold War to move from Central Europe to Central America. Take note, Central Europe to Central America. The first point that we focus on is, when did the Cold War start? Remember what I said earlier? I said that the Cold War started immediately after the Second World War. So the Cold War started in 1945, where in Europe, but moved to Central America in 1959. So when we look at the word Central America, this word, Central America, this is between North America and South America. There were Americans in Cuba, very important that we understand that part. Many Cubans traded, take note, Cubans traded with Americans. There was a gap between the rich and the poor Cubans. America had military bases in Cuba. So that was now why it had to move from Central Europe to Central America. Why was Cuba so important? From the onset of the Cold War, take note, from the onset. Onset means from the start of the Cold War up until the 1950s, the USA focused its attention on Europe and Asia. So Cuba was not involved at that point in time. But in 1959, the USA extended its influence to Central. Take note, in 1959, they extended the influence to Central America. At the center of the crisis was the Caribbean islands of Cuba, which was located 150 kilometers south of the mainland of the USA. So when we focus on the map that's been given to us here, we can see that here's Cuba. So from Cuba to the USA, it gives us the 150 kilometers. So this part of the USA, as we can see, it is called Florida. So Florida is a state within the USA. So from Cuba to Florida, it is 150 kilometers. Why was Cuba important still? Because there were Americans in Cuba. Many Cubans traded with Americans. There was a gap between the rich and the poor, and America had military bases where? In Cuba. Now let's quickly look at the proximity of Cuba and the USA at whole. If the Cubans had missiles within their own country, we can see the first missile will actually be launched in Texas. This is where we will find Texas. Then we can see it can reach as far as Canada itself also. Then we see the other one can reach as far as Salt Lake. So that was the distance that the missiles could actually reach if there would be missiles in Cuba. So we can see that it was short range and it was long range missiles. Now, USA and Cuba relations between and before 1959. Let's look at it quickly. It says pro-American leaders. When we look at pro-American leaders, we refer to them as capitalist leaders. Many businesses in Cuba were owned by Americans. Very important that we understand that part. Many businesses in Cuba, it was owned by the Americans. Many Cubans traded with American businesses. Main crops such as sugar was sold to the USA. There was a wide gap between the rich and the poor Cubans. There were several American military bases where? In Cuba. USA and Cuban relations after 1959 continues. Fidel Castro, which is the picture that we see, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba after defeating Baptista in 1959. Castro adopts, take note, adopts anti-American ideas and implements communism within Cuba. The USA refuses to buy Cuban cigars. Castro turns to the USSR for help. USSR agrees to help Cuba, take note, Cuba is a country, to set up missile bases in Cuba. The USA fails in its attempt to assassinate, take note, they failed to assassinate Castro. So when we go to the next slide, it still continues by saying that USA and Cuban relations after 1959. Before 1959, it's imperative that we understand that Cuba was a capitalist country. But after 1959, things began to change. So the first point that we're focusing on is the crisis in Cuba nearly resulted in what? In a nuclear war. That's the first point that we need to look at. The second point is America had built a huge naval base. So when we talk about naval base, we're talking about ships in Guantanamo and had invested heavily in Cuba. Why did America invest in Cuba? Because of the trade that they had and the businesses in Cuba. America played a big role in the liberation, take note, in the liberation of Cuba from the Spanish in 1954. Meaning that America was part of the liberation of Cuba from the Spanish people. Then, let's look at the role players quickly. There were about more role players, but we're looking at the important people that shaped the Cuban Missile Crisis. We can see that Baptista, he was the capitalist leader that Fidel Castro defeated in 1959. Then John F. Kennedy. Now before John F. Kennedy, it was Eisenhower. Now Eisenhower started the process of what we'll be dealing with later, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Then from the USSR side, we see Nikita Khrushchev. So these four were predominantly like the key role players during the process of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now let's quickly look at the American response after Cuba now turned into a communist country. The first point that we need to look at is USA was concerned that Cuba would be a communist state in front of their own eyes. Remember that Cuba was 150 kilometers away from where? From the USA. So that was a concern for them. That was the first point. There were fears, take note, there were fears that communism would spread to the rest of the American continent. So when we speak about the rest of the American continent, we're talking about Latin America. When we talk about Latin America, we are talking basically about South America. So if you are not sure where South America is where you find Argentina and when you find Brazil, because those are the pertinent names of the rest of America. America then embarked on a policy containing communism. Take note, we are using the word America because why? Everyone is familiar with the word America, but we are supposed to use the word USA, United States of America. So America started with a process called containment policy. So the two policies that it started off with, it was the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. It was to ensure that certain countries must not fall prey to communism. It means keep them capitalist countries. This was now after World War II. Then refusing to buy Cuban sugar, this is what the Americans did now. Ended up all trade and cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba. So what happened now is that after Cuba now turned to communism, the Americans refused to buy sugar from Cuba, and at the same time it ended all trade relations between the USA and the Cubans. The American response when Cuba turned to communism. America hoped that, take note, they hoped. Who hoped? America hoped that she would starve Cuba to submission. Take note, we're using the word she because any country is called a she. Then the second point is, this drove the Cubans closer to the Soviet Union. America thought if they could starve the Cubans by not supporting them from buying sugar, it would starve them. But look what the Cubans did. They went further to the Soviet Union to start negotiating processes. Then the Cold War then intensified. Take note, it intensified in Cuba. Now the question is, how did it intensify and between who? It intensified now between the USA and Cuba. Then, but let's go back a little bit. We need to understand that before Cuba went to the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. Earlier we saw that the assassination failed against Castro, so let's look how that played along. The first point that we need to look at the failed Bay in Pig invasion. Take note, I'm using the word failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The USA decided to support the Cuban exiles. Take note, the exiles. Now, when we look at the word exile, exile means you are a political threat to who? You are a political threat to your own country, and for that reason, you are running to another country to look for refuge. So we need to understand what is happening currently here. The USA decided to support the Cuban exiles who were forced, take note, they were forced off the island by Castro after attempting to overthrow Castro. The CIA, take note, Central Intelligence Agency, it's only found in the USA, formed a group of exiled Cuban politicians into a committee in Florida to overthrow or to take over from Castro. The CIA, take note, the CIA trained Cuban exiles, supported by President Kennedy. Take note what I said earlier. Dwight Eisenhower, the former president before Kennedy, started this whole process. But Kennedy just took it over. Then, to support an invasion by who? Invasion by the exiles. They intended to establish what? A base in Cuba to attack Castro and hope they would gain the support of the Cuban people. The Bay of Pigs continue. The invasion at the Bay of Pigs, take note, the Bay of Pigs is an area on the southern part of Cuba, was a dismal failure. Why was it a dismal failure? Only 1,400 exiles landed, supported by the US bombers, flown by Cubans. They faced 20,000, take note, 20,000 Cuban troops when they landed at the Bay of Pigs. There was no popular, take note, no popular uprising as proposed or that was supposed to be planned. There was no popular uprising to support the invasion. Exiles not killed were taken to prison within Cuba. Kennedy denied all invasion plans. Why? Because Cuba was a small country and it embarrassed the world that a small country could defeat such a massive country. Then, what were the results of the invasion? Castro declared Cuba a communist state. Take note, Castro declared Cuba a communist state after the failed Bay of Pig invasion. In December, take note, when did Cuba become a communist country? Only in December 1961. But when did Castro defeat Baptista? In 1959. So we must not get confused with the two dates here. He asked the USSR to provide what? To provide arms in order to defend Cuba against who? A possible American attack or a possible American invasion following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. So after Bay of Pigs, Cuba went where? They went to the Soviet Union and said, listen here, we need you to provide us with arms and we need your support also. Why? So that America must not invade us again. Then our second point, Khrushchev agrees to provide arms. Take note, Khrushchev agrees to provide arms and made a public announcement in 1961. He secretly hoped to turn Cuba into a Soviet missile base. But before we continue with this point, it is imperative that we understand that Fidel Castro did not agree with the planting of missiles in Cuba. But take note, Khrushchev secretly hoped to turn Cuba into a Soviet missile base. The last point, this created greater fear. Where? In the USA. Take note, it created fear in the USA of the spread of communism throughout the region. Kennedy stated that the USA would isolate Cuba and warned the USSR not to place missiles in Cuba. The increased tension between superpowers. Now, very important that we understand this part. Who were the superpowers? There were only two superpowers after World War II. It was USSR and the USA. Why did Khrushchev send missiles to Cuba? Let's look at, we've got 4 points that we have here. The first point is they had to defend Cuba. After what? After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, learners, it's imperative that we understand Bay of Pigs was an area on the southern part of Cuba. That's important that we understand that. Why do we say Bay of Pigs failed invasion? Because that's where the 1,400 exiles landed. And for that reason, we name it after the place where they landed. Then, let's go to the next point. It forced the USA to negotiate. Take note, to negotiate to remove missiles from Turkey. Now, let's just stop a bit there quickly. It's imperative that you understand that USA had missiles in Italy, West Germany, Japan, and Turkey. So meaning that the USA surrounded Russia before the Cuban Missile Crisis started. But let's continue. Why did Khrushchev send missiles to Cuba? It was a catch-up with the USA in the arms race by placing missiles as close as possible to the USA. What I've mentioned now is USA planted missiles in West Germany, Italy, Turkey, and Japan. So when you look at the map, it's basically covering, it's basically surrounding the borders of the USSR to show Soviet strength and force Kennedy to surrender. Cuban Missile Crisis intensifies. On the 14th October, an American U-2 aircraft took a series, take note, a series of investigations. Photographs 12 miles above the island on the 5th of October. 15 October, defense experts concluded that the site was being prepared for a number of medium-range ballistic missiles, which would soon be ready to be fired. 16 October, Kennedy set up an executive committee as he was so tense about the report. So when we look at this photo here, this is now a photograph taken on the 22nd of October 1962 by the USA U-2 spy plane. Two of the sites clearly show missile launch positions. So when we look at the map, we can see here it indicates missile ready tent. At the bottom, it shows former launch positions. Then it shows us former location of ready tents. Then it shows us the fuel trailers. So this is one of the missile sites and one of the photos that were taken by the U-2 plane. So with that evidence in mind, the USA had to do something now. This is why when we continue with the Cuban Missile Crisis that intensifies, we need to look at the 4 points also here. In August, USA spy planes observe weapons. The photo that I've shown you before, that was an observation of the weapons. On the 1st September, Khrushchev sent nuclear weapons to Cuba. 4th September, Kennedy warned USSR not to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. On 11 September, USSR assured CIA that it would not base nuclear missiles outside of the USSR. So now we can see both sides were not honest with one another. The CIA lied. At the same time, USSR secretly went to place missiles in Cuba. So on the 22nd of October, Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba. It means ships with weapons to Cuba, ships with weapons to Cuba were blocked off. Later on, I will show you a map clearly identifying how they were blocked off. That evening, on the 22nd of October, Kennedy went live on television. Take note, he went live on television, broadcasting to the American people that the USSR had planted missiles where? In Cuba, and that they are in danger of what? Of a nuclear war. So what did that bring to the American people? First of all, it brought to the American people that the leader, J.F. Kennedy, he was assuring their safety first of all. Second of all, he was assuring the people that what is happening currently in Cuba. So if they would notice the blockade, they will know that the blockade has been set up. Why? Because of the missiles that was placed in Cuba. But to the American people, Kennedy at that point in time looked like he was the hero. All right, then on the 23rd of October, very important, 23rd of October, the Soviet government, take note, the Soviet government. We need to understand now that USA on the 22nd set up a blockade. They set up a blockade, went live on television, but the following day, the Soviet government insisted what? They insisted that it was simply helping the Cubans to defend itself and that the USA was interfering in Cuban affairs. Meaning that Khrushchev was accusing USA of pushing the world towards the nuclear war. We must understand, learners, that after the Second World War, 1945, the Cold War started, which was a war of ideologies, of words, and it is imperative that we understand now here that Cuba was first a capitalist country, then they turned into a communist country when Fidel Castro became the new leader. But on the 23rd October, something else happened. First, the Soviet government accused the USA of trying to invade Cuba. That was the first thing. But on the same date, the blockade was in place. The blockade was in place, meaning that all Soviet ships filled with weapons were blocked off in the Atlantic Ocean, stopping them from entering into Cuba as a country. Now, if we look at this photograph that's here, we see the red line. I'm drawing a red line. This now signifies the blockade, or what we would call a quarantine. So quarantine, blockade is basically the same idea, the same meaning, blocking something off. So we see here that the Soviet ships came from the Soviet Union this way, but when they came here, this is where the quarantine was set up. These ships, American ships, were lined up from there right across. And by doing this, it blocked off all USSR ships that had weapons within it. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis intensifies further. On the 26th October, take note, we stopped at on 23 October, now we're moving to the 26th October. 26th of October, Khrushchev wrote a letter to who? To Kennedy, hinting that he was ready to make an agreement. What agreement? By promising, take note, he says he's promising that they would back down if Kennedy promised that he would not invade Cuba. That was the first point. So the first point, the reason why Khrushchev wrote the letter was he was trying to persuade Kennedy not to invade Cuba. That was the first point. The second point was, agreement was that USSR would withdraw missiles, provided that USA would withdraw their missiles from where? Turkey. So now we see now, Khrushchev tried to come up with a solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because why? The world was now at the brink of a civil war, basically. What we can also look at, learners, is when we look at our concepts, at this point in time now, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we call it Brinkmanship, because the USA and USSR are pushing one another to the verge of what? Conflict almost. Then when we continue, the executive that was set up by Kennedy advised Kennedy not to give in to the USSR demands. And the crisis seemed to, it was seeming that it was getting out of hand now. But on the 28th October, take note, 28th October, an American U-2 plane, the same plane that took the first photographs, was shot down over Kennedy by Castro. So this now clearly intensified the Cold War crisis in Central America. Kennedy believed that Castro was following USSR orders. Kennedy was advised to launch an attack on who? Cuba. But take note, thank God for Kennedy's wisdom here. The world was on the brink of a nuclear war when the U-2 plane was shot down. Take note, when the U-2 plane was shot down, Kennedy's attitude softened a little bit. Remember, he announced live on television, we are placing a quarantine, we are setting up a blockade to prevent all USSR ships from entering into USA and Cuban waters. Why? Because of the missiles that were set up in Cuba. His brother, take note, this is not his cousin, his brother Robert Kennedy solved the crisis. He suggested that USA should reply the first message and ignore the second one. Now, what was the first message, boys and girls? The first one was USA must promise not to invade Cuba. What was the second one? The second one is they must remove their missiles from Turkey. Then Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba, but would not, take note, he agreed not to invade Cuba. This is the first one. But would not make a decision on Turkey. So this decision on Turkey, what did it mean? It means this would be our surety. If all the missiles are not removed, it meant that missiles would still be in Turkey. Then the crisis continues in Cuba. In return for the Cubans, very important that we understand that. America demanded the withdrawal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. So what Americans said now is, you want us not to invade Cuba, so please remove the missiles from where? Cuba. But Turkey was not mentioned from the American side. But on the 28th of October, Radio Moscow announced that the nuclear weapons would be removed from where? From Cuba. Privately, take note, privately the Americans agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey. This was privately done, as long as the USSR kept it a secret, must not make it known to the world. Then, what were the results of the crisis? Very important that we understand. So before we move to the results of the crisis, it is imperative that we understand that both USSR and the USA, they went to the United Nations, and through the United Nations, this crisis was actually resolved almost. But let's look quickly at the results of this crisis. The crisis had important results, very important that we understand that, all right? For both USA and it included Cuba as a country also, and also for the Cold War. Khrushchev, let's look at Khrushchev first. Khrushchev claimed that he had achieved, take note, he had achieved the aim of preventing what? An American invasion in Cuba. So he boasted about it. He was criticized by China. All right, so now we're going back now to China as an essay. Remember that Mao Zedong criticized Khrushchev that he is doing what? Softening communism. So he was criticized by China, by Mao Zedong, for backing down in the face of American threats. He lost face at home. He lost face at home. What does this mean? It means that the people said he's a weak leader. He's a poor leader. His decision was not good for the benefit of the country. And the crisis led to his unpopularity. At the same time, Khrushchev lost his position as the USSR leader. Now let's look at Kennedy. So before we go to Kennedy, very important, Khrushchev claimed that he had achieved his aim by preventing USA from not invading Cuba. He was criticized by China for softening communism. He lost face, meaning he lost his position, and the crisis led to his unpopularity in USSR. Let's look at Kennedy quickly. Increase his reputation at home and worldwide by avoiding a war and forcing Khrushchev to back down. So now we can see, boys and girls, that Khrushchev to the world was seen as a leader, but within his own country, he was seen as a weak leader. But let's look at Kennedy. Kennedy within his country was seen as a leader, as a hero at the same time. It's important that we understand that those are the questions that might be asked. How do you perceive? How did the people in USSR perceive Khrushchev? How did the world perceive Khrushchev? The world perceived Khrushchev as a good leader because he prevented a nuclear war. Kennedy was perceived in his country as a good leader, as a hero. To the world, Kennedy was also perceived as a good leader, as a hero. Why? Because both him and Khrushchev avoided what? A nuclear war. Now let's look at Cuba. Cuba remained a communist country, all right, up until now, depended on the Soviet aid and protection. Very important that we understand it. Up until now, Cuba remains a communist country from 1961. Khrushchev and Kennedy realized how close they had come and brought the world on the verge of a what? Nuclear war. We can also indicate, after saying nuclear war, we can put in brackets World War III. Because remember now, countries were supporting capitalism, other countries were supporting communism. So that would have resulted in the Third World War. And also they avoid and prevented such boats set up a telephonic hotline direct from Kremlin to the White House. So when we look at Kremlin, Kremlin is the White House where? In Moscow. The White House is found where? In Washington. So it was a direct line between the two presidents trying to resolve what? Trying to resolve the issues between the two countries. So let's quickly go back quickly. All right, when we look at this picture here quickly, this picture indicates to us that the Soviet Union did plant missiles where? In Cuba. So this was now an indication that the Cuban Missile Crisis intensified. Very important. Why did the USSR plant missiles in Cuba? This was after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. So after that, this is what happened now. Cuba went where? Cuba went to the USSR to ask for protection. And as they received protection from the USSR, it is imperative to understand that, boys and girls, because of that, it increased the tension in within Cuba as a country. But it also led to brinkmanship. Because of this photograph that you see here, it increased the tension within Cuba, but the USA set up what? A blockade. And the blockade now resulted into what we call brinkmanship between the two countries, trying to push one another to the verge of a war, of a nuclear war. And because of that, these two countries, under the leadership of Russia, Khrushchev, and Kennedy, we see that they try to resolve this issue immaculately. Now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it is imperative that we understand, if it was not for these two role players, Khrushchev and Kennedy, it would have been difficult to resolve this issue. But let's look quickly at the options that Kennedy had when he discovered that there were missiles sites within Cuba as a country itself. The first option that we look at, let's look at A as the first option. The option was do nothing, allow missiles to be based in Cuba. It means allow the missiles to be set up and do nothing, but there would be a risk to it. But let's look at the advantage. The advantage was give time to prepare response. Take note, give time to prepare response. What would be the disadvantage? The disadvantage would be Kennedy would be seen to be a weak leader. Why a weak leader? Because he's not responding to the missiles that's being set up. Khrushchev would look now as a strong leader where? In USSR. And this would be a threat to the USA security as a country. The second option that Kennedy had, attack Cuba with nuclear weapons. Now that would be very dangerous because innocent people would now lose their lives. Now what would be the advantage to the USA? Strike first, before the Soviet Union can even think to attack the USA. Now what would be the disadvantage? Full-scale nuclear war that signaled what? The end of humanity. So when we look at that, the end of humanity, when we look at Nagasaki, Hiroshima, we can clearly remember how many people, more than 500,000 people lost their lives because of those two bombs. So if there was a nuclear war, it actually destroyed mankind in totality. Then let's look at option C. Option C, airstrike against the Cuban missile bases using non-nuclear weapons. It means the conventional way of sending out missiles, but it must not be a nuclear missile. Destroy missiles and sites already in Cuba. That would be the advantage to the USA. But what would be the disadvantage to the USA? War with Cuba, perhaps the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Now let's look at the last option. The last option, blockade Cuba with US Navy, no Russian ships allowed through. Let's look at the advantage. The advantage is limited pressure be increased on a later stage. Let's look at the disadvantage to the USA. Missiles and sites in Cuba would not be affected. Soviet Union might do the same to West Berlin. Now, boys and girls, these four, they were the options that the USA had. But the USA decided to take option number 4. And because they decided to take this option, this is what we call brinkmanship happen now. Because why? They were watching each other eyeball to eyeball. When the USSR ships approached the blockade, the USA ships were on the other side. They were watching each other eyeball to eyeball, ready to do what? Ready to launch at one another. So it was imperative to understand why was the quarantine set up. Remember, quarantine is what we call also a blockade. So it was set up in order to prevent USSR ships from entering into USA and Cuban waters. Now, boys and girls, because of the letter that was written to USA by Khrushchev, that began to soften the pressure. But very important, you boys and girls, that we need to understand when we focus on the last point here, that Khrushchev and Kennedy realized how close they came to do what? To start World War III, and also at the same time to start a nuclear war. This also, they prevent such. Why? Why did they try to prevent this? Because if the world was entangled in a nuclear war, it would destroy humanity as a whole, meaning the next generation must restart what has been built before. But this is what they develop. They develop an open line, which they called a hotline, direct from Kremlin and the White House. Now, boys and girls, if you can clearly understand now what we are trying to say here is that before 1959, Cuba was a communist country. Why? So before 1959, Cuba, before they became a communist country, they were a capitalist country. Then 1961, they were now established. Please take note, they were established as a communist country. Why? Because the exiles went to the USA, and the USA built a group of exiled people that would now, those people would now go back to Cuba. They would try to invade Cuba, overthrow Castro. If Castro has been defeated, now they would reinstate capitalism again. But the Bay of Pigs invasion was called a failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Why? Because Castro was ready for them and defeated the exiles. And because of that, Castro immediately now went to the USSR to support them. So the USSR indicated to the USA, we are supporting Cuba. Why? Because you wanted to invade them. So in order for you not to invade them, missiles has been planted secretly in Cuba. We must understand this point, that it was secretly planted within Cuba. USA did what? They set up a quarantine. After setting up a quarantine, they will now face eyeball to eyeball. What happened here is that after this incident, then Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy. But please understand this. Khrushchev only wrote the letter to Kennedy after Kennedy appeared live on television. It was even on the newspapers. The blockade has been set up to prevent USSR ships to further place missiles within Cuba. Then after the letter was written to the USA, and this is what happened, boys and girls, Kennedy replied to it. Now, as I have explained to you, his brother Robert Kennedy intervened in this whole process, and because of his intervention, the USSR and the USA came to a conclusion by stating that we are creating a hotline from Kremlin to the USA. And that resolved the crisis with regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis within Cuba. And after that incident, communism, in brackets, seems to be weakening a little bit within the USSR as a country. So boys and girls, this is pertaining to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope that you have enjoyed my lesson. I hope that you have a better insight with regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope that you have a clear understanding now pertaining to this specific topic. And boys and girls, remain safe and continue to read through your work and study with persistence. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.